Good morning, Nick. Well, it's good morning for me. I think it's good afternoon for you over in San Fran in Stanford.
Yeah, that is right. It's actually always very nice to talk to folks in Australia from the West Coast because it's the quiet time of our day. Yeah, on the West Coast, mornings are busy and afternoons tend to be kind of quieter because Europe has gone to sleep.
Yes. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on the floor plan today. I have been following your work for a long time since I was doing my PhD, which I finished in 2017, which only seems like yesterday, but obviously wasn't. And probably like you, when I started doing my topic on the physical environment of the workplace and the impact of different types of space and location on a range of outcomes, a few people were like, oh, do you really think that's a thing? And then, of course, the pandemic happened. So
Exactly.
I cited your paper, Does Working from Home Work, in my PhD, which I think that paper now has over 3,300 citations. Was that the one that really sparked your interest in remote work?
Well, thank you for the site. First of all, it's very kind of you. And kind of yes and no. I mean, the history of me getting involved is, a long time ago, back in the early 2000s, I worked at McKinsey. And then I left McKinsey and went to work at the London School of Economics. And I was interested in management because obviously I've been a consultant at McKinsey. And I started collecting data on management practices. One of the things I noticed was every firm has, in an industry at least, has a rough sense of what is good and bad management. So I used to work in retail in the UK and it was, Tesco or Walmart or Marks and Spencer's. But that's fine on practices. But when it comes to kind of work-life balance, there's enormous variation. So, I noticed that my wife, she had two different employers and one gave her, the statutory minimum maternity leave and one gave 6 months full pay. And I kind of thought, well, obviously the second was great, but it was odd that firms in the same industry would have such a different set of practices. So I started to collect data. This is now 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And then I was very lucky. I kind of got interested in it. I was very lucky that I had a student, James Liang, in my class in 2008 and 9 in Stanford, who was the founding CEO of this company, trip.com. So that's how
Ah.
I got to do the randomized control trial and all the other work. But my interest had been piqued from, early 2000s.
Yeah, your experiences there. Just for listeners who may not be familiar with that paper, just tell us quickly a little bit about those results and why you think that was so groundbreaking at the time.
Yes, I've run two, I guess there's three, but I'm working on now, but I'll tell you at least about two right now, randomized control trials. So randomized control trials are A/B tests. They're very common in tech. Everyone listening has been subject to hundreds and hundreds of them. You just probably don't realize. So whenever you go onto a web page of Amazon or Facebook, or probably less Google, but any web page that's complicated, often the firm is randomizing, like how big is the font and which thing do they mention first and what do they suggest and how many colors and how quickly all kinds of stuff. So, I live in Silicon Valley. Many of my friends are in tech firms. They're doing this all the time. And it's kind of like the way that you test drugs in a sense. There's,
Mhm.
treatment and control group. So that is the gold standard for evaluating stuff. And we wanted to do the same kind of test on work from home. So the first randomized control trial I did was to take 250 workers in a call center. So these are folks who's all day, every day, they're answering telephone calls from customers. And we randomized them by even and odd birthdays. So if you had an even birthday, born on the second, fourth, sixth, eighth of the month, etc. So it's pretty random. And for folks that had an even birthday, they got to work from home for 4 days a week. And folks that had an odd birthday kept coming into the office all 5 days. And we did this in 2010 to 2012. So the thing ran for up to 2 years. And initially, before we started, the view was of the company was save a lot of space by sending folks home because the days they come in varied by team. So, if team A comes in on Monday, team B on Tuesday, you can basically have 5 teams in the same bit of space. So you save a lot of office space. But they thought, well, of course, people will goof off if they work from home. And
Watch Netflix.
yeah, it was like at the time the joke was the three great enemies of working from home: the bed, the fridge, or the television. And
No, no, maybe no. Netflix was pretty early back then.
yeah, it was like, or computer games. That was
Yeah.
actually, if you look at the demographics of who worked in these call centers, a lot of young people. Yeah, and so they thought, well, we're saving office space, but they goof off. We ran the study, we published it. The findings are actually pretty eye-opening as why it had a large impact, which was actually people working from home are 13% more productive. And you're like, what
Yes.
on earth? And it turns out in call centers, they process 9% more calls per minute when they're at home because it's quiet. And when you interview them, when you visit these call centers, it's really obvious because call centers kind of low wage, offices are pretty dense, it's very noisy. If you've ever tried to ring a call center and it sounds like the person asks you to repeat or answers the wrong question, you're like, it's frustrating, but it often because they can't hear. So that was
Mm,
9%. The other 4% of the improvement in productivity is they actually worked more minutes. So they're all supposed to be on the same shift, like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. But when you're in the
mm,
office, what you see when you look at the data is folks take longer lunch breaks. They take longer toilet breaks. They're more likely to arrive late. They're more likely to
mm,
take sick leave. I mean, you can imagine you're kind of feeling not great, or you got to let the plumber in. So that was result one. Result two was their quit rates halved. Which is also great. Result three was less obvious. Whether it's good or it's probably bad, but their promotion rates halved. So that was the
mm.
original study, and I'll stop there. But we ran that in 2010 to 2012. There have been some repeats of that study, and the results seem to hold up even now. In fact, I was talking to a huge tech company on Monday, and they were reporting similar findings in their own call centers.
Mm. Yeah, it was definitely a groundbreaking study. And I want to come back, especially to that promotion rate, because that is, I think, one of the kind of things that's still held up as a barrier. But you are constantly, I think, probably one of globally the calm voice of objectivity who is consulted very frequently, which is brilliant, in a sea of all these media grabbing headlines on we must go back to the office
Yeah.
5 days a week. The world is going to end as we know it if we don't go back to that. I want to talk to you about obviously the raft of evidence that you're putting out almost on a weekly basis around this. But before we do that, I'm curious as to what you think is the reason for this. Sort of, I've got my thoughts from where I sort of sit in the organizational behavior kind of space, but why are we so hung up on this when we proved conclusively that it does work?
Well, I tell you a data fact. I do a lot of exec ed, an enormous amount of exec ed, talking to companies, managers. And normally the first thing I start with is say, look, I'm a very data focused person. I'll just give you some data. Turns out, if you look, I have the best data for the US, but also some global data, including Australia, New Zealand, UK, etc. That since 2023, about summer 2023, levels of work from home have not fallen. So people are initially like, that can't be true. We know everyone's returning to the office. No, that's not correct. So there's three different data series that all show this, and you can argue with one of them, but it's hard to argue with all three. So one is just surveys. So we in the US Census survey about 10,000 people a month, and you reweigh. There's ups and downsides of surveys, but that's data set one, and it's flat. Obviously, work from home is very high in 2020. It fell through 21, 22, but it seems to have stabilized. Data
Mm-hmm.
set two is swipes into office buildings from a company called Castle Security that run a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those door swipe things. And again, I don't know, you can argue with that. And some people, don't swipe in and out, but it's a totally different data set, but it shows the same thing. And then data
Mm.
set three is from Placer.ai, which tracks cell phones. And they look at office buildings with at most one floor of retail or non-office. And they show the same thing. So people returned to the office in 21, 22, 23, and then they didn't return anymore. So then, like,
Mm.
I pretty much at this point, it's pretty clear that people are not on at net return to the office since 2023. Why does it feel like they are? The reason it's like incentives 101 is, what, we teach MBA students or econ students, which is I talk to a lot of journalists, and quite reasonably, journalists are incentivized to write stories that people click on, they read, they post on social media, they comment. Turns out, if you write a story that says, Goliath National Bank is hauling you all back to 5 days a week or return to the office, people like angrily click on it and comment and send it around. If instead you write Goliath National Bank has increased work from home days by one, it just gets forgotten about. So
Mm.
the problem is, and I don't know how to fix it, but it's kind of like what I'll call the media of shark attacks. No one doesn't report. There's been no shark attacks for a month, but as soon as one happens, it's sprayed all over the place. And so
Mhm.
it generates this kind of false impression we're returning to the office when in fact we're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk a lot about this kind of got what's called the Goldilocks zone of what's the optimum amount of time in the office. And I think, of course, we can say, it's hard to say because it varies by industry, it varies by the type of people you are, the type of team you are. But is there a kind of sweet spot that you see in the data of what's the optimum time in the office?
So we have data on thousands of companies. Why don't I just focus on the Fortune 500? So they're the largest,
Perfect.
most profitable companies around the world. What you see in that group of companies is roughly 50% of employees going every day. So just pick, I don't know, McDonald's to take an example. Anyone flipping
Mm.
burgers, cleaning the stores, security, transport, all of that, they're going to go in every day. There's no way around it.
Yep.
There is about another 30% in those companies, which are managers and professionals, probably most of your listeners, that are going in typically 3 days a week. It's not all the same. Like my daughter has a summer job right now, and she's going in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for a kind of consulting firm. That'd be very standard.
Mhm.
And then there's a final group of about 10% of employees that are fully remote. Who are they? They tend to be back office, a lot of HR, kind of
Mm.
payroll processing, call centers, some IT support. Why is it ended up like that? It's ended up like that because it's profitable. So,
Mm.
ultimately, when I talk to execs, I'm like, you want to do what is profitable for your company because that, boosts share price, keeps your CEO and your board happy. And
Mm.
why has it ended up that way? So I have another paper in Nature in June of last year where we did a separate randomized control trial on 1,600 employees in a big tech firm. And
Mhm.
they were very different. They weren't in call centers, which is a kind of very repetitive, boring job. These were people in marketing, accounting, finance, and computer coding.
Mm.
And we randomized them again into treatment was 2 days a week work from home. So that's like they work from home Wednesday, Friday, came in Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, kind of classic hybrid. And control was just staying in the office 5 days a week. What you saw in that sample, this is, professionals, basically. They're all grads. A third of them had MBAs, masters,
Mhm.
is their productivity is about flat. So it wasn't better, it wasn't
Mm.
worse. When you interviewed them, they said, look, I've got to come in. It's really valuable to come in for mentoring, for building connections, for building culture. But by the time I've come in 3 days a week, it's not
Yeah.
obvious that, days 4 and 5 are that useful. Plus, it's quieter at home. I can concentrate and there's less commuting. So
Mm.
we have a ton of performance metrics. They're not better, they're not worse. What you do see is employees really liked hybrid and their quit rates fell by 35%. And when we spoke to the company, they said, look, every person that quits costs us about $50,000 because we've got to go out, we've got to re-advertise the job, we've got to interview them, we've got
Mm.
to get them in, put them through, the introductory training, get them up to speed, get a manager to spend more time with them. It takes them 6 months to get out there. And so they said, look, if we go to hybrid, we're boosting profits by about 20 million a year because we're
Mm.
cutting costs. So that's kind of where it's ended up. For big companies, it's a mix. And
Mm.
it's great for society, it's good for parents, good for the environment, but I'm not really pushing that at this point anymore. I'm pushing it, companies should do it because it's profitable.
Yeah, and that's what I love about you coming from that economics lens is, yeah, actually this will make you money. It's not just, feels good, the employees will be kind of happier and the managerial perspective. It actually makes you more money. And is that the answer to overcome that bias that we see that you found in your original study about the promotion tax, I suppose, that, if you're in the office, there's that face time, there's the performative aspect. I'm more likely to remember or promote people who I see around me than the ones who might be working equally as well, but aren't in my face every single day.
Yeah. So in the call center case, it is tricky. So I'll give you a way you can work from home without suffering the promotion bias and a way you can't. So the way you can is if you're in a team where everyone else on the same schedule. So Libby, imagine me and you work for, the very big tech company and we're both just coming in on Wednesday. You can
Mm.
imagine that Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, when we connect up, it's on Zoom or Teams or whatever. And we occasionally have off-site. So if you look at
Mm-hmm.
firms like Airbnb or Upwork, they meet
Yeah.
in person every other month, but
Yep.
mostly they'll be on Zoom. In that case, you're not really falling behind because you're part of the team. You're getting assessed on what you're supposed to do. They'll have proper trainings, etc., and ways to develop you. Version B that is really problematic is we both work together. You go in 4 days a week, and so does most of the team. I live far from the office and manage to, persuade the managers to let me go in 1 day a week. Now, I may be happier, and it may be because I have a 2 hour drive each way. But ultimately, the data says that I'm going to suffer in terms of promotions. Why? I'm not going in and not getting as much face time, which probably means my development and mentoring is slower. I don't find out what's going on. I'm also
Mm.
potentially discriminated against because I'm forgotten about. But
Mm.
collectively, the thing you don't want to be is an outlier from the rest of the team. So remote
Mm.
works, and it doesn't seem to damage promotions as long as it's consistent with the rest of the team and the company you're in.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? That the key where you're the one person who's, remember the bat phone? I don't know if anyone still has those in their office where, the conference call and everyone else is in the room and the person on the bat phone in the middle is like, hello, I'm still alive. Has anyone forgotten about me here? You've published also on how we measure working from home, which is another one that is always a point of great discussion now that we're not in Henry Ford's factory where we're being followed around and measured every second in terms of what we're doing. So tell me a bit more about what you found in terms of that measurement aspect.
Yeah, it's not easy. So I'm going to take, there's various ways to talk about this. I'm going to take it from the most practical management focus, which is from the company. So
Mm-hmm.
I have many, many, many times heard execs say our policy is, our employees. Like, last week I had a meeting with a firm and their CHRO was in the room. And so I was asking him, okay, how many days are your employees supposed to come in? And everyone in the room, it's the C-suite, it's a very senior group of folks, said, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
everyone's supposed to come in 3 days a week. And I was like, how many days do they actually come in? And there's kind of silence, and no one said anything. It's just like smiling. And CHRO said, "Well, I don't really formally look at it, but I do have the swipe data. And in fact, I didn't have to ask anything because other folks in the company are like, well, what does it say?" And he was like, well, it looks like people are coming in 1.5 days a week. Turns out that's
Mm.
actually very normal. So what you
Mm.
generally see is if you're supposed to be in 3, you're in 1.5. We're supposed to be in 4. You see folks are in 2. Now, the big question is, what is going on? Where's that missing?
Mm.
If you're supposed to be in 3, which is the norm, what's the missing 1.5 days when people aren't in? It is some combination of non-compliance, people traveling for business, out on sales events, meeting customers, etc., sick, holiday. And
Mm-hmm.
because of that, it actually turns out to be, and also apparently badge swiping. So you
Mm.
often see it. Sometimes folks will kind of go in through the machine, it's open on the way, and it depends on the type of security you have, but often folks will kind of tailgate others. And then if you
Mm.
don't go out for lunch, you're never swiped in. So
Mm.
what do you do about that? It is hard. And it's one of the reasons, if you look at, say, Amazon, which has mandated folks to supposedly be in 5 days a week from January 2025, it is not really happening in many offices because they can't measure it, or if they can, nobody knows what's going on. It's actually really hard. Libby, I mean, to give you a very concrete example, I've had execs say to me, so like, Libby, if you're my manager, imagine you're my manager at Amazon. You
Mm-hmm.
probably have a team of 8 people. You're paying Microsoft to let me work from home 3 days a week, or OpenAI or whatever. And so you
Mm-hmm.
say, sure, Nick, I'll give you air cover. And if I get harassed by HR, I'm just going to say you're traveling for business 2 days a week. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
you're incentivized to do that because I'm
Right.
your team. So that's why it turns out enforcement of these things is and measurement of them is actually really hard. So
Yeah.
it's why people measure it by tracking cell phones. Turns out, Americans, Australians, Brits, almost everyone that's listening, I'm pretty sure you're within 6 feet of your cell phones. If you can track a phone, you can track a person, but it's actually quite hard to track
Yes.
individual people into individual offices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the misnomers that people have, or the misconceptions, is that before the pandemic, it was this beautiful utopia where everyone was so engaged and so productive when we were there 5 days a week. In fact, office occupancy that was considered sort of full was around about 70%. Offices were never, because like you said, people are on client sites, they're on leave, they're doing all kinds of things. And so this idea that, now we're trying to measure occupancy at some 100% is, yeah, a very strange idea because it's never been that. And it's basically impossible if you think about it for those practical reasons you said, that everyone is going to be in the office, even if you have a 5-day a week mandate. Is this changing, Nick, the geography of labour markets in terms of remote work? Because I think we saw this quite pronounced in the US, perhaps more than other places, where people during the pandemic went, right, I can work from home and maybe I live somewhere very expensive like San Francisco or New York. I'm going to move somewhere else in the country. And then that's caused various issues if companies have called for a return to office mandate. But how is this changing the labour market in terms of geography?
Totally. So if you take Stanford University, so we have 20,000 employees. We have 8,000 of our employees coming every day. So they're food service, janitorial, transport, security. They really have to be in nursing. We have 2 hospitals as part of the university. There's then 10,000 folks like me, other faculty, administrative staff that are hybrid, typically in 2 or 3 days, depending on the unit. And then there's about 3,000 folks that are fully remote. So why do we do that? For hybrid, for faculty and staff like me, it's basically kind of a recruitment and retention tool. Like if you force them to come in 5 days a week, we could do that for sure, but you basically have to pay them 5-10% more to stop people quitting because they don't like it. And given that, there's no productivity benefit, it's not worth it. Then on fully remote, the reason we have fully remote is there's a lot of studies on this, and it really depends on the role. I mentioned call centers, fully remote can actually be more efficient and more productive per hour. In other roles, it can be less efficient. It depends. Why, even in roles where it may be less efficient, the reason you may do it is the person you get can end up being a lot cheaper. So again, for Stanford, we have a regional pay scale, and it turns out the southeast of the US, which would be, say, Mississippi, for example, or Alabama, their pay rates are 70% of the Bay Area. So like for like person, even if, for example, they were 20% less efficient, which is a huge gap at Mississippi, if they cost 30% less, you can still potentially be up in it. So ultimately, what it looks like is labor markets have become much more regional and global. I talked to a company earlier today. The CEO was in Texas. The company's spread all over the place. The other person, his CHRO, was actually in Mexico. And he said, we just hire the best people wherever we can get them. So for folks listening, I often get asked about, and I mean, I must have spoken to a couple of thousand managers and firms, and I often get asked about, is working from home more or less productive? And I actually think that's not quite the right question. The right question is profitable. Because, for example, for fully remote, you may find they're 10% less productive, but they're highly profitable because A, you don't have to pay for office space, which is roughly 10% of salaries. And B, you may be able to hire them, say, if you're in the US in a lower wage place, which is a further 20% reduction. So you can see the same person is 10% less productive, but 30% cheaper, and you're up on the deal. And so that's ultimately what's driving this. This is why remote has ended up, fully remote and hybrid are here to stay. And they're shifting where people are hiring. I was talking to Deal that do a lot of international contracting, and they said the most common contract in their book is American companies hiring Argentinians. And I said, what is that? And apparently it's tons of American firms are hiring Argentinian and Brazilian coders, HR people. It's the same time zone. And, it's 40% the wage rate.
Yeah. I was going to ask you next, how is remote work trends, or how are they differing globally? And are there any countries or regions who you think, they're doing it better than another one?
Globally, we've collected data from more than 40 countries. Globally, what you see is English-speaking countries. So the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Ireland, which we've got data from all of them, have the highest levels of working from home. They tend to traditionally be kind of very Anglo-Saxon management, performance-based. So like Libby, if you were managing me, a classical setup would be like, I have quite a lot of autonomy. You kind of don't micromanage me, but look, if I'm doing badly, I'm in trouble. And in, well-run, big American, Australian, British multinationals, you don't suffer fools indefinitely. So if I'm doing badly, performance review after performance review, I'm fired. And so in that kind of setup, you'll go like, Nick, sure, you can work from home 2 days a week. You just better deliver. If you, Northern Europe, a little less, Southern Europe, less. When you go to Latin America, Africa, work from home levels are lower. Asia seems to be the lowest. Now, why is it? Why is, Japan, South Korea, China relatively low on work from home? I think from our data, it looks like a bunch of it is quite cultural. There's more of a focus on FaceTime. I couldn't be certain. I wouldn't say that's the most exact science, but it looks like that. And you certainly hear that when I talk to multinationals who say, look, in the Beijing office or the Taipei office, we see, people are more or less, not totally, but mostly back in the office. But in Dallas, they're still, only coming in 3 days a week.
Yeah, I think definitely, and what I sort of see from my lens is that, what people often have much smaller homes than in Asia, in those countries, than compared to places like the US and Australia. So they may not have suitable work from home arrangements. They have multiple generations very commonly living at home with them. And as you said, there's that in Japan, they still have the karoshi, right? Where you're dropping dead from overwork. The government's tried to intervene, but you can't leave the office before the boss. And so, yeah, being from home is still a remote, a very foreign concept. It's changing a little bit with the declining population and participation in the labor force, but I think that's still a huge issue.
I think
So,
it means, by the
yeah.
way, there's, one of the companies I've worked with a lot, Trip.com, they're
Mm,
NASDAQ listed, but they're Shanghai based. For them, it's hugely profitable to go to hybrid in large part because very few other companies are offering it. So if you want to
mm,
work from home even 2 days a week, Trip, is the best bet. And they're not the biggest tech company in China, but they're able to hire often the top talent because of this. And so, yes, if you're
yes.
listening, if you're, I've had discussion of in Japan or South Korea, etc. Actually, it's an enormous advantage to be able to offer this even a couple of days a week, as most other places aren't.
Yeah, I was in Japan in April actually, and Microsoft, as you know, did an experiment with the 4-day work week, and there was a lot of communication about the results on that. But one thing that wasn't reported so widely was how much they saved on air conditioning, because Tokyo is extremely hot in summer. It was well into six figures, even for the very short period of the trial. So, as you said, if you bring that back to that profit lens, that's often a really good place to start this discussion. So, amongst that, what do you see as the future role of the office? Because that's the other big question. And then we have the property trusts and all of the headlines about, oh my goodness, but what's going to happen to all of the commercial property values?
Yeah, I know they're down. So I know, San Francisco, for example, is about the worst hit city in the world, and
Mm,
their property values are down about 50%. I mean, that is a large adjustment. Bearing in mind, if you've, say, bought an office and, you bought it 10 years ago, you're still probably up on where you paid for it because there's a huge ramp up. So,
mm,
yeah, it's hard to know whether you should shed too many tears because folks are up, they're just up less. If you bought it in 2020, certainly, or 2019, you've done badly.
mm,
In general, though, it hasn't damaged office valuations nearly as much as you'd think, because for big companies that are on, or any companies on hybrid, the
mm.
main reason people come in is to work with colleagues. So,
Yes.
there's two of us are in a group with, let's say, four others. It's not much, but, Libby, you're on a Monday, I'm in on Tuesday, Joe's
Yep.
on Wednesday, Sarah Thursday, and Ruth Friday. You're like, what does that achieve? It's like we
Nothing.
come in and
Yeah.
we're zooming. So firms tend to coordinate. In many companies, they end up coordinating quite honestly on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Mm,
Friday's like a dead day. London
yeah.
Underground and Friday had Friday for a while as off-peak travel. It was so
Oh,
quiet.
really? Wow.
Yeah, like
Interesting.
Friday's very quiet in all of this data. Monday's quieter. So it's turning out to be a bit of the saving grace of office real estate. So demand is down a bit, but
Mm,
actually supply is contracting because there's less
hmm.
new build being constructed and some being converted. So, the office market is kind of healing itself. Even in San Francisco, it's actually getting better. It's being filled up. What's happening is rents have dropped a bit,
Mm,
valuations are down, and people are moving back in. So I think it would, much like you said, it's exactly your comment again, which is you said pre-pandemic desks are only 70% full, which is the number I've heard. If you were to randomly walk into an office on a Tuesday, 70% of the desks would be full in 2019. It was also
mm,
the case pre-pandemic. If you looked at the whole week, or 168 hours,
mm,
offices were really only used for about 60 hours. It's like, Monday to Friday, I don't know, 8 till 6 at
mm,
best. And now, rather than being used 60 hours, they're probably used more like 40 hours. And so,
mm.
yeah, I mean, is that terrible? Yeah, but if in the office, not particularly in the office real estate market, it's not been cataclysmic. It's been, a punch in the face, but it's certainly not a knockout blow for the market.
So, are you advising real estate leaders or city planners on the future in terms of should we be looking at dramatic change, or is it actually not that big a deal, as you said, because most companies are still always going to want to have an office because it's a significant branding statement, it's a cultural statement.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a bunch of, large office companies. I don't know, about a dozen of them, and quite a few large cities, certainly in the US and the UK. I'm trying to think in other countries.
Mm,
Um, the worst hit again is my nearest city, San Francisco. That's probably the worst hit city in the whole world. Why
mm,
is San Francisco so badly hit? Just to be clear, it's because it's very focused on tech and
mm,
finance, and tech and finance were the two industries with the highest work from home. Why is that? Because they have people that work on computers. People
yeah.
kind of get surprised about finance. They have in mind Jamie Dimon or David Solomon. But if you look at it as an industry, compare it to say retail, manufacturing, food service, healthcare,
Mm,
education, you can much easier to be a banker. working from
Mm,
home on Monday, Friday than it is, say, a nurse. And so
exactly.
San Francisco, because of that, has a lot of hybrid work, and that has reduced footfall in the city, reduced retail spending. Some people have moved out to the
Mm,
suburbs. I honestly don't think it's terrible. It's an adjustment. But
mm.
one thing, again, you have to have been around long enough. I remember in the 2010s, there were huge protests against techies driving up the prices
Yes.
of apartments. Google used to have these buses, and at least two different occasions, people threw bricks at them and smashed
Yes.
the windscreens.
Yes.
And that's all stopped because as the techies and bankers have fled out to the suburbs because they don't
Mm,
need to be in the city centre, it's pushed rents down and meant for essential service workers, I don't know, nurses, firefighters, etc., is a little bit more affordable. So I don't think this is not epic changing. These people forecasting the demise of the city. I'm not really sure anyone was, but there were fears in 2020 it may, but it's
yeah.
turned out it's pushed it back. I mean, if you were to, take the long haul of things from 1980 to 2019, cities were getting better and better. So as a
Mm.
kid, I visited New York in 1981. So I was born in 73. So I was like 8, almost 9. I remember going with my parents. And the thing I remember was going to McDonald's on Times Square. And this was during the lunchtime. There were two security guards at the door, both with open carry guns. Now, as a kid growing up in Britain, I was
Yeah.
like,
Shocking.
shock.
Yeah.
But looking back in it now, how bad must the crime have been? Do you need two, not just
Right.
one, but two with guns on display? So that tells you how bad city centers
At
were.
McDonald's.
And
Exactly.
McDonald's on Times Square. I mean, so you see it in the crime statistics. City centers in the early
Mm,
80s were really pretty bad. People didn't want to
yeah.
live there.
Yeah.
From the next 40 years, they got better and better. The pandemic's kind of unwound 5, 10 years of that. It's not done. It's not killed cities. It's pushed them back to 2010, but that's about it.
Absolutely. I was in Tokyo in April, and I think it was the most busy I've ever seen. And I've been going there for a while because, on top of, yeah, everyone's still going to work, but you've got most of Europe. It felt like most of Europe was there, and it's become the number one tourist destination for Australians, and maybe a lot of Americans are going there as well. But interesting, you talk about tech and finance with the San Francisco trend. I was looking at a study recently that showed that the top digital nomad uptake is from tech workers and from finance services people, which was a bit of a surprise. I wasn't as surprised by the tech workers, but yeah, one software engineer, I think he's been to 50 countries in the last 2 years. So, great. If you love traveling as well, it's a good opportunity. Are you seeing any particular technologies or trends, Nick, that you're watching that you think are going to fundamentally reshape knowledge work? I mean, obviously, we've got the whole AI conversation that's accelerating every week. But where do you think knowledge work is going to end up? Is it like the City headline, complete doom and gloom? Are we landing somewhere in the middle?
I'll start small and kind of scale up. So I
Mm,
guess I know the work from home world best. One trend I'm definitely seeing is there are a bunch more companies that are helping HR folks and real estate folks manage people coming in and out. So if you go back to 2020, there was like companies using Excel spreadsheets and stuff to like figure out who was cut. It was really chaotic, and it matters because if you're in, I'm in, and if we want to see if the boss is in, but you can imagine if somebody's visiting as a new product rollout, and how do you book space? So that's been an explosive. I think I mean, what there's companies like Cadence I've been working with. That
mm,
life is good for them. More if you step back a bit, there's a lot of tech that I've seen for making it easier to have virtual meetings, from holograms to massive screens to
mm-hmm,
think of Apple's augmented reality to the
mm,
headset
mm,
thing that came
mm.
out. So if we were to predict till 2030, right now, we're talking over Zoom. I've
Yes.
shrunk your picture into something really small that sits just below the camera on my laptop, because my laptop camera is right at the top. And if I have
Yes.
the screen, it looks like I'm looking at your shoes or So
Yeah.
I'm looking at a 2 inch by 2 inch, and it just seems like we have to be better than that. So that's changing. So connectivity type of technologies are definitely changing. If I step back yet further, you're correct that AI is an enormous, amazing change. One area I do see it having a big impact that it's just my area I know best, is on fully remote workers. So
Mm,
if you break down tech into hardware and software,
mm-hmm,
software now feels like it's run ahead of hardware, in the sense that, Libby, I could, maybe not now, but in 2, 3 years, you could come up with an AI Nick, and you probably after a bit figure out, because I'd glitch, be like one of those sci-fi movies. But it's getting pretty good. You can get close to live stream people, and you've seen these media stories of people
Yeah,
fake.
Raoul Powell has done that. Have you seen the finance guy? He has an avatar. I think he was an ex-Wall Street guy, and he has an avatar, and you can ask it questions, and it does a daily update on finance markets, and it's his avatar. And yeah, you can tell, but gee, it's pretty lifelike.
Yeah, exactly. There's that person, geez, it was terrible, who was it in France who thought they were dating Brad Pitt or something and had,
Oh yes, yeah, that's a
I
bad
mean,
application.
but
Really
you can see it, that's happening. So
mm-hmm.
fully remote, what it tells you is maybe 3 to 5 years, you're going to have AI that can get close to fully impersonating people, have pretty articulate conversations, which is a real threat to some of the lower level, more repetitive, fully remote jobs. So call centers, payroll, HR, a lot of this stuff is at risk. Um, Anything that's hybrid requires an in-person role is far less at risk because in-person technology, as in physical robots, are just 1 or 2 decades behind. So if you've watched Terminator type movies, these humanoid or Blade Runner,
Yeah.
these things, they don't exist, and I don't know, they're 20 years away, but they're not in my working
Mm,
lifetime. And so in that sense, I think AI is quite a threat to a number of relatively repetitive
mm,
remote jobs. I think for hybrid, for folks like us, less so. I'll end in an anecdote, which I thought was interesting for a kind of Bay Area tech, which was
mm,
it's connected to real estate. So I was visiting Google, and Google has this amazing, huge campus. And I was walking around with someone, and they were showing me around the campus. At one point, I was looking around buildings. There was an amazing vegetable garden out the back of one of the buildings with a bunch of employees tending the vegetables. And I said, wow, that's cool. And she was like, yeah, the Google employees, they like to go, farm cucumbers and tomatoes at lunchtime to kind of let off steam. And I was like, that is a very expensive thing for that real estate. And she said, well, look, this history of this plot is kind of complicated. What happened is Google bought an old building that sat on there. So they have an enormous complex in Sunnyvale, south of in Silicon Valley, and they're slowly buying the buildings all around. And they bought a building that was owned by some other company. They ripped it down, and they were going to put a much bigger, taller building on it to expand capacity for the firm. But about mid 2024, Pinchai, the CEO, decided because AI was making techies so much more productive, they were not going to keep increasing headcount anymore. So the
mm,
kind of the forecast from up high came down. We don't probably need any more space. So after having ripped down this building, they're like, well, what are we going to do with this empty lot? So they decided just to kind of basically rake over it and grow vegetables on it. So that was never the original plan. It's the most expensive vegetable garden I've ever seen, but it was kind of fascinating that in inside take that all of these tech firms, their hiring has been growing. It's now moving sideways because
mm,
AI is making existing workers so much more productive that we don't need
mm.
to hire any new workers. So I don't know how much further that's going to spread out, but you can kind of join the dotted lines 5, 10 years from now. I could say AI is having a big impact even on net hiring of hybrid workers.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Is there a myth, Nick, about remote work that you wish people would stop repeating if there was just one you could choose?
Um, there are two myths, and I can give you the genesis of both myths. One we kind of covered earlier. One is remote work's ending, and it's not. It's stable for the last 2, 3 years. The genesis of it is it's like the shark attacks. You probably get the impression that sharks are eating people every day if you read the news, because you just see
Certainly
it.
in Australia.
Yeah, I don't know. I looked at this when I first came to the West Coast, but it's just that this stuff or murders that celebrities are getting murdered all the time or attacked, and yes, it happens, but it's over. It seems more common than you believe. The other myth is that work from home is hugely unproductive, is isolating, makes people depressed. This is often put out by CEOs that want everyone back in the office as a kind of a smokescreen excuse. And in their minds, they somehow extrapolate. So they remember 2020, which I agree was not great. I mean, it was for many reasons, including we were all forced to lock down. And
Mm,
most people don't want to work from home 5 days a week. When you survey folks, only 30% do. 70% want to come in at least one day a week. So
mhm,
70% of people didn't actually like being fully locked down. Um,
mhm.
they wanted to stay and spend, most people want to spend some, the average person wants to work from home 3 and be in the office 2. But so a lot of CEOs remember kind of the dark days of May, June 2020, and they have in their mind that is what work from home is. And I'm like,
Yeah,
that's an extreme version. That is not
yeah.
what anyone's doing anymore. And people are actually in surveys report being happier when they're able to work from home 1 or 2 days a week. Yes, they do not like being forced, the average person, to be home all 5 days a week in, week out, and not able to step out the front door because there's a pandemic on. But they also doesn't mean they want to go to all the way to the other extreme of being forced in every day for 5 days a week. So that's the other myth that's frustrating. I occasionally hear it. Some big
Mm.
exec, to be honest, often like my demographics, above 50 man, will stand up and say, well, you got to come in. It's for your own good. And, I find that deeply frustrating because one of the things, Econ 101 is people tend to choose things that for their own good. And if people aren't choosing to come in 5 days a week, generally they don't think it's for their own good. So forcing people to do things generally doesn't help their happiness.
I could not agree more. That's a sentiment I regularly share as well. I know listeners will be really fascinated, Nick, to hear about your own schedule. And I know it's probably super hectic because it varies every semester. And I imagine you're traveling a lot. But how often do you generally tend to work from home? And what kind of tasks do you prefer to do from home versus when you go into campus?
So great question. I'll explain in a minute, but just to put this in context, I live on campus. So Stanford campus.
Oh, right.
Jane and Leyland Stanford, that founded the university, 1885, I think it was. They left an enormous plot of land that includes the university, but something like 10,000 faculty homes. I live in one of them. So
Wow.
with that in mind, yeah, I'm like 5, 6 minutes bike ride. I actually
Nice.
go in most days, but I probably spend six, I probably spend 50% of my time at home, probably 25% in my office on campus or teaching, and 25% traveling for conferences or other locations. So
Mm.
I'm roughly 50-50. And
Mm.
when we measure work from home, if you're traveling for business, that counts as in office time. And on that basis, I'm probably 50-50 here. I have a lot of Zoom calls, reading, writing. I do at home. I work a lot with co-authors, do data work, analysis, writing grants, preparing
Mm.
for teaching. And then in person is definitely teaching, meeting with students, particularly undergrads. It's generally better. And, one of the issues is funny, you find this with junior employees. For undergrads, if I want to meet them on Zoom, they often don't have a great place to go. Like,
No, they
they,
don't. Their bedroom. Yeah.
yeah, well, like if they want to meet me in my office, we can meet in my office. It's a private space. We can talk and they can come in and we can discuss. We're not bothered. If instead I want to do it over Zoom, US undergrads typically are 2 or 3 people to a room. And it's not easy to find a quiet space where you're not going to be overheard. And so if you want to, I don't know, broach a sensitive topic, I find generally it's better to meet people in person. Seminars, presentations, meetings, big meetings are best in person. So I am very much hybrid. I also don't have any fixed schedule. We're right now in the summer holiday, so it's very quiet.
Mm.
In the
Mm.
term time, there is some fixed schedule because we have outside speakers come and give talks. So basically, like our group has a Wednesday in. Interesting thing is, we're all on Wednesday in the economics department, but say the English department, who are great, and I know some of them as friends, they have a different schedule. So I often use this as an example for big companies. You don't necessarily need the entire company on the same cadence, because if you're not working with another team, you totally want to come in with your own team, because when you're in, you want to see them in. But depends on how you work with other teams, whether it makes sense to co-organize with them.
Yeah, definitely. Uh, Nick, I know really have appreciated your time so much today. Love to hear before we wrap up what you're working on next. And are there any kind of under the radar trends that you're currently exploring?
I talk about just 2 research papers, but I have kind of interesting so what. So one more business, one more policy. So on the business one first. So we've been working with a company that runs call centers, and they were fully in person before the pandemic. They went to fully remote because of the lockdown and discovered actually productivity was up, turnover went down, and they saved an office space. So they found operating a call center was dramatically more profitable, so it's remote. So they felt like, okay, we're in a much better place. They then started to notice after time that people got disconnected. People who'd been hired remotely, worked remotely, there was some real sense of loss of connectivity to the firm. So we've been recently doing a randomized control trial with them, having one group of employees come in 1 day a month, and they come to an office, they work together and do some trainings, they have free lunch for 1 day a month. We just got some of the early results back from that, and it looks hugely positive. They're more productive. Their quit rate dropped by half. And interestingly, I was talking to some other companies earlier this week who were saying, look, it's similar to what we do with a bunch of our employees. We rarely have people really, really, really fully remote. even
Mm.
remote or distributed, we still meet in person once every other month. So that was kind of research one, just trying to put some numbers
Amazing.
on it. And it does look like basically what I call gatherings
Mm.
or events,
Hmm.
probably what you want to do every other month, every month. The
Mm.
other research, more policy wise, is we've been collecting data on fertility, birth rates. And what you see is when folks can work from home, either one of a couple, for one or more days a week, you see higher birth rates. Now, I
Mm.
won't get into all the details. We've done this across multiple countries about it's kind of, the research underlying this, the epidemiology is kind of complicated about what's causal, what's a correlation. But just the
Mm.
stylized facts are if you take a couple and you control for industry, country, income, education, everything you can see, and you have both of them working from home 2 days a week versus both
Hmm.
of them going in 5 days a week, on average, they have zero point 0.5 children more total fertility, which is a lot.
A
You know,
lot.
that is
Yeah,
an
a lot.
enormous amount. And the reason I say this is it's become a huge policy issue. I mean, East Asia, South Korea has fertility rates of zero point 0.7, which means each
Yeah.
generation they're more than halving.
Mm.
North America's low. I mean, Australia is probably low. Much of Europe's low.
Yep.
So I raise this if there's anyone engaging with policymakers, including
Yeah.
my own in the US, the Trump administration, they're banning work from home, but they're also
Right.
trying to encourage, they're banning basically immigration and trying to encourage population growth. So the only way you do that is from higher fertility rates. And
Hmm.
these policies don't go together. It's like
No,
if
you
you
don't.
if you make it hard to have kids because you have to go into the office every day, you're going to find less kids. And so there's another big so what for policymakers that fertility is very much driven by allowing people to. I mean, the 4 day working week will be similar. The more flexible the
Yeah.
working conditions
Right.
are, the easier it is to have kids.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'm so excited to see when that comes out. And you probably saw when you've been doing this research in Japan, the government has tried to institute, a working from home Friday as a policy to increase the birth rate. And they've even developed an app for people to use to try and encourage that. But apparently the conditions on the app are that you can only use it if you have an intention to like get into a relationship and get married and have more children. So I'm not sure how that's going to go. But yeah, I mean, for Japan, as you said, for like South Korea, it's an enormous issue. Well, looking forward to seeing the results of those come out, Nick, as with all of your work. Thank you so much for your time today. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you. And yeah, we will be sharing these with listeners very, very soon.
Libby, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to talk.